Okay, at this time we will invite questions from the audience. If you could just state who you are. If you're with an organization, just mention that, and then direct your question to one or all the panelists, whatever you like. Ron, go ahead.
Am I on?
You're on.
Ron Stein. The question's for Ben. The statement about Biden wanting to change the mileage standards and reduce CO2 emissions by 5%. To me, it's apparent he must be oblivious to the fact the United States represents about 4% of the world's 8 billion people. In the developing countries that need abundant, reliable, affordable electricity, they got a lot of coal-fired power plants. China, India, Indonesia, Africa. By the end of 2030, those 4 countries are expected to have 3,000 coal-fired power plants. How are the Americans, they're going to have to incur the cost and lifestyle changes, going to react when this becomes transparent over the years that we're basically trying to reduce CO2 emissions here and we're losing ground to the developing world?
All right. I think that was addressed to you, Ben, but if somebody else...
Yes, it was addressed to Ben.
Okay.
I didn't quite, forgive me, I didn't quite follow what question you're asking about the U.S. versus as part of the world.
Well, we're going to incur a lot of cost to reduce 5%, CO2 emissions by 5%. And that cost is going to be out of our pocket, and it's going to affect lifestyle standards that it's going to be regressive on the poor people. And when we recognize that, you know, we're trying to reduce emissions when the world is increasing emissions, we're losing ground. And is it just a state, something to make us feel good?
I mean, you're absolutely right. And, you know, it's already been recognized that a number of nations, the Chinese and others, will not meet their Paris agreement, their Paris commitments, their national determined contributions, nor will any, quote, strengthening, unquote, of the NDCs to be established in Glasgow later this year, next month, I guess, will matter. The problem really is much more fundamental. If you look at the nationally determined contributions, the promises made by the signatories to the Paris Agreement, what you will discover is that the emissions reductions that have been promised are all relative to a, quote, business as usual, unquote, baseline. In other words, nation X is saying, okay, if we don't do anything, our emissions will follow this particular path. We're going to cut our emissions below that path by X%. That's our promise. Well, the business as usual baseline is driven by assumptions about economic growth between now and the end of the century, right? The faster economic growth, the more your emissions are going to be. And so if a nation overestimates its future economic growth by a couple tenths of a % per year, which then, you know, when economic growth proves slower than that, they will have achieved their emissions cuts without any underlying actual reduction in their emissions behavior. I mean, it's really quite a scam, and that really is the right word. And I think that sooner or later, people are going to recognize that, and that the whole thing is really a perpetual motion machine for bureaucrats and foundation presidents and corporate honchos and leftists to, you know, go to fancy resorts on someone else's dime and eat in fancy restaurants and fly on private planes and do all the things that they're urging the unwashed masses not to do.
Yeah, I might add to that. James Hansen, the father of the climate alarm, has called the Paris Agreement a fraud, a complete fake. You know, he says the only way you're going to address this is by having high carbon fees, his fee and dividend, but you're going to have a real high tax. Everyone is going to have the tax. You're going to have international trade restrictions, so-called border adjustments. And this is just a start, and Hansen and others think that nuclear power is going to be the answer, but the new generation nuclear power plants, a couple of which have been completed in the Middle East, are 4 to 5 times more expensive than a gas-fired plant, and they take 7, 8 years to build. So the other side's in a real quandary here.
All right, can we have a second question?
Dr. Zeicher, my name is Dennis Groh. I'm from the Detroit area. Just a follow-up question. When the EPA in its proposal was asking or talking about credits and benefits like gas savings, did they also include in there the discounted cash flow for the increasing cost of the automobile to meet the energy standards, or is that just kind of conveniently left off?
Well, there's some arm waving in the regulatory impact analysis about the effect of the rule on the price or the cost of building vehicles. But I think I've got to go back and look at it. I haven't looked at it in a while, in a couple of months at least, but my impression at the time is they were lowballing. We have estimates of what it costs to produce vehicles with greater mileage characteristics in terms of lighter materials, more advanced transmissions. You know, the environmental left likes to pretend that's all free. It's not, of course. The EP, I don't remember the numbers, but I remember my impression was they were lowballing those numbers, and they were vastly smaller than the fuel savings. Well, fine. Then the question becomes, why aren't people buying those cars, voluntarily? If the fuel savings is so much greater than the present value of the capital costs, it's a great deal. Why not? Why do we observe consumers not doing this? I can't get a straight answer to that question from anyone involved in this process.
Hi, Greg Goodnight, Right Climate Stuff. Ben, this question's for you. I thought Mr. Biden made this cost-benefit thing very easy. He signed an executive order right after he took office saying that for henceforward, they're not going to consider cost-benefit in the environmental area, that in other words, any amount of cost is justified for any amount of benefit. Is it legal to do this? I mean, what are the practical effects of this executive order?
The Clean Air Act, as amended, says that the establishment of national ambient air quality standards must protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety without regard to costs. I'm paraphrasing, but cost considerations are not to be are proscribed in terms of establishing the national ambient air quality standards for criteria pollutants. So already the emissions, once you reach an equilibrium, once the regulations are established and the states implement their rules and approach attainment of the NAAQS in the various regions, if cost considerations are excluded from the regulation of criteria pollutants, then the emissions of those pollutants are already too low because you're considering only benefits and not costs. And so, but for hazardous air pollutants, not criteria pollutants, but for hazardous air pollutants, costs are relevant, and the courts have determined that the regulations have to be, quote, appropriate, meaning they have to pass some sort of benefit cost test. You can't just impose a regulation without, the Obama administration tried to do that in their MATS rule, the mercury and air toxic standard, and the courts threw it out because they couldn't show any benefits, but they were showing hundreds of billions of dollars of costs.
Will that specific executive order hold then?
I'm sorry?
Will that specific executive order that was signed in January hold? Will it be legitimate? Will it be upheld by the courts?
I don't know. The lawyers have to fight that out. I'm just not sure how the judges would
Okay, I'm sorry, we're coming up to the end of our time. We have time for one more question.
Okay, probably a short question for Rob Bradley. In 1972, I had a physics class, and my professor, I guess you'd call him a bit woke today, we have one of our books from that class was a Sierra Club battle book on energy by Paul Ehrlich. And in that book, he was, amongst the strategies, he was mentioned nuclear fission, and he thought it had a lot of good possibilities. So has his position on nuclear fission changed significantly since then, or is he still holding to that?
That's a real good question. The environmentalists and nuclear, you know, there's a split over the, with them. I don't think Ehrlich is on the nuclear bandwagon even now. He probably, you know, nuclear fission is sort of the dream of dreams. You know, it's always out there, it's always possible. But even the new generation nuclear technology, number one, it's new, it's experimental, there's going to be trial and error, and whereas the most recent nuclear plants we built here in the U.S., Plant Vogtle in Georgia, the cost on that is something like 10 to 15 times greater than if they had built a natural gas combined cycle plant for the same megawattage. So I'm a nuclear pessimist, I hate to say, but it is a backstep technology. But as far as I know, Ehrlich and the Sierra Club are still anti-nuclear.
All right, well, that will conclude our time here, and I want to thank you for attending. Our speakers will be up here at the front if you have any further questions, but thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of the conference.